In the autumn of 1886, Emily Cole was cast out of her dead husband's claim with 2 children and $7. She spent it all on a burned-out homestead, a blackened stone foundation, a cracked double chimney. Everyone said it was cursed. But when the coldest winter on record hit and the real arsonist came begging for shelter, that chimney revealed its secret. It held heat like a forge, and it would decide who survived the storm. She arrived with a toddler on her hip, a 6-year-old dragging behind, and every neighbor's door already closed. Her husband Thomas had died clearing a log jam 3 counties over, and his family called it negligence, blamed her, then cast her out. The only thing anyone would sell her was the old Becker place, a burned-out hollow on the edge of the settlement. The price was $7 because no one believed the stone foundation could ever hold heat again. They were wrong. The double chimney had once been built to serve a smithy, and the fire that gutted the house had only tempered the rock. As the first killing frost crept down from the bitterroot, Emily Cole was about to discover that her $7 ruin held a secret that would either save her children or get them all murdered. Because the man who burned that homestead was watching from the tree line, and he was running out of time. The man in the tree line was called Jeb Corey, and he had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the smoke cleared 3 years earlier. He had watched the Becker claim sit empty through 2 summers, its blackened stone foundation cracking in the frost and nobody willing to rebuild. Then Emily Cole arrived with a wagon so light it barely pressed tracks into the dirt, and Jeb knew immediately that his own survival had just gotten thinner. Emily did not see him. She saw only the ruined homestead, a rectangle of charred log walls still standing in a few ragged places, the double chimney rising from the center like a stone backbone that the fire had refused to break. The roof was gone entirely. The door hung from one leather hinge. But the children were already cold and hungry, and the sun was dropping behind the bitterroot peaks, so she laid a canvas tarp over the least damaged corner, dragged the iron kettle inside, and lit a small cooking fire against the frostbite wind. That first night, a strange thing happened. The stones of the chimney began to breathe. Emily had built her tiny flame directly against the soot-darkened hearth, but the heat did not simply rise and vanish. It soaked into the thick rock and then, hours later, began to radiate outward into the room. By midnight, the temperature inside the canvas shelter was 30 degrees warmer than the air outside. Her 6-year-old Jacob stopped shivering. The toddler, Ruth, fell asleep with her fists uncurled for the first time in 3 days. Emily sat awake beside the embers, one hand pressed flat against the stone. The rock was not black with soot, she realized. It was black from hammer scale, from decades of iron heating and cooling against a forge bed. The double chimney had once served a smithy, and the man who built it understood something that most frontier builders did not. He had laid the inner flues in a split spiral, twisting the 2 columns around a central thermal core. And that core, even after the fire that consumed the house above it, was still whole, still functional, still capable of holding heat longer than any ordinary fireplace should. What Emily did not know was that the builder was still alive, and he had already seen the smoke rising from the chimney. The history of that homestead had been dark long before the fire. Old man Becker had been a German smith who came west after the war, dragging a forge wagon across the plains until he reached the Bitterroot foothills. He built the chimney first, before the house, before the barn, before anything else. He fired the forge inside a temporary lean-to and began shoeing horses for the cavalry post at Fort Missoula. The homestead grew outward from that stone heart, but Becker's temper was legendary. He trusted no one. He kept a ledger of every debt, every slight, every tool borrowed and never returned. And in the spring of 1883, someone burned him out. The fire started in the hay loft, but it spread faster than a man could run. Becker was found 3 days later beside the creek, half his body scorched and his ledger missing. The marshal ruled it accidental. The homestead went unsold for years, because no settler would risk living on ground where an old man had been cursed enough to burn alive. Then Emily Cole paid $7 for it, because $7 was all the world had left her, and she had stopped believing in curses the morning her husband's body was pulled from a log jam on the Clearwater. Thomas Cole had been a good man but a poor planner, and his older brother William had never forgiven him for marrying a woman from the wrong town, the wrong church, the wrong everything. When Thomas drowned, William arrived within the week to claim the farm. He told the county recorder that Emily was unfit, that the children were in danger, that the land rightly belonged to his branch of the family. The legal fight was over before it started. Emily had no money, no lawyer, no husband to sign deeds. William gave her 3 days to leave. She walked out with 2 children, a single trunk, and the $7 she had hidden inside the flour tin. No one in the settlement would take her in. The women at the church turned their backs, not because they believed William's story, but because they were afraid of him. The one boarding house in town posted a sign that read "No vacancy" the morning her wagon rolled up. Emily spent 2 nights beneath a leaky canvas beside the river, watching her children cough and listening to the wind carry the first bite of winter down from the high country. Then she heard about the Becker place, still unsold, still unwanted, and still standing. Or at least, the chimney was still standing. She did not hesitate. She handed over every cent she owned, signed a receipt she could barely read, and drove the wagon east toward the blackened stone that would either save them or kill them. The first snow fell on October 19th, earlier than anyone in the valley could remember. It dusted the burned timbers and drifted into the corners of the canvas shelter, but inside the chimney's warmth, Emily and the children stayed dry. She began patching the remaining walls with pine boards salvaged from a collapsed shed. Jacob helped by dragging kindling in a gunny sack. Ruth toddled around the hearth, her small hands patting the warm stone as if it were a living animal. Emily cooked beans over the embers and watched the way the heat curled upward in 2 separate columns, the spiraling flues drawing air from different angles, creating a convection pull that fed the fire without stealing warmth from the room. It was during that second week that Jeb Corey made his first move. He came to the homestead at dusk, hat pulled low, claiming to be a trapper headed south who had heard smoke was rising from the old Becker place. Emily met him at the edge of the burned-out wall with the fireplace poker in her hand and a look that said she had already faced worse than a stranger. He complimented the chimney. He said he had once known a man who built such things, a German with a temper and a ledger. Emily told him the German was dead. Jeb's face did not change, but the skin around his eyes tightened. He drank 1 cup of water, asked too many questions about the children, and left before the last light faded. That night, Emily could not sleep. Something about the man's voice had been wrong, too calm, too practiced. She dragged a heavy timber across the doorway and kept the poker beside the bed. The chimney held its warmth until dawn, and she lay awake listening to the wind scrape the dead grass beyond the wall, knowing in her bones that the real danger was not the weather. The real danger had just found them. By early November, the Bitterroot Valley was locked in a cold so deep that the river froze solid enough to drive a wagon across. The old-timers in the settlement said it was shaping up to be the hardest winter since '46, the kind that killed livestock standing up and buried cabins in a single night. Emily had already stockpiled enough wood to last a month, but she had no way to get more if the drifts closed the trail. The nearest help was 6 miles away, and the neighbors who had refused her shelter in September were not going to risk their necks now. Then the chimney began to show its full power. One afternoon, with the wind screaming outside and the temperature dropping so fast that a wet cloth froze stiff in seconds, Emily accidentally let the fire burn down to almost nothing while she tended Ruth, who had caught a fever. She expected the room to go cold within minutes. Instead, the stone walls of the hearth continued to radiate gentle, even warmth for nearly 3 more hours before she had time to rebuild the flames. The thermal core was not just holding heat, it was banking it, releasing it slowly, turning the entire chimney into a heat reservoir that could outlast any lapse in fuel. Emily Cole realized that if she could keep that fire going, she and her children might actually survive this winter without freezing. What she did not realize was that the man who built that chimney, the man who had burned it down 3 years earlier to destroy a ledger that proved his theft, was now watching from the frozen tree line with frostbite blackening his fingers. Jeb Corey had tried to erase his past with that fire, and instead he had created the only thing standing between Emily Cole and a frozen grave. Now the temperature was plummeting toward 40 below. The storm of the century was gathering over the Bitterroots, and Jeb Corey had one desperate choice left. He would have to walk back into that house, into that heat, and take it for himself, even if it meant leaving a widow and two children in the snow. The temperature dropped 30 degrees between sundown and midnight on the night Jeb Corey finally admitted to himself that he was going to die if he did not get inside that house. He had been living in a hollowed-out pine stump 3 ridges over, wrapped in every piece of hide he owned, but the cold was no longer a weather event. It was a weight. It pressed through the seams in his coat, filled his boots like frozen sand, and turned his breath into a fine white powder that settled on his beard and stayed there. His right hand had gone numb 2 days earlier, and now the fingertips were blackening. He stared at them in the dim firelight of his small camp, and understood that frostbite was not a warning anymore. It was a countdown. Jeb knew exactly what that chimney was doing inside the homestead. He had watched smoke rise from it every day for weeks, and he recognized the slow, dense quality of the burn, green wood feeding a thermal mass that absorbed and released over hours. He had helped build that forge chimney when he was a younger man after the war, when he still traveled with Old Man Becker as an apprentice. He knew about the split spiral flue, the way the inner core was packed with river clay and crushed limestone that turned hard as fired brick after the first 100 burns. He knew that once the stone was hot, it stayed hot through the coldest hours. He had put that knowledge into the hands of the very man he later killed. It had not been an accident. It had been a book. Becker's ledger contained a line that Jeb had stolen from the cavalry payroll 3 summers earlier, a theft that he had buried under false receipts and lies. Becker had written it all down in his cramped, obsessive hand, not out of malice but out of habit. Every transaction, every debt, every discrepancy. And when Jeb realized that his apprenticeship was ending and that Becker planned to leave the ledger with a deputy in Missoula, he lit the hay loft. He had not intended to kill the old man. He had only wanted the book to burn, but Becker ran into the flames to save his forge and the roof collapsed. Jeb dragged the old man out too late, then fled with the ledger still clutched in his coat. He had thought the homestead would sit empty forever, a scorched warning. He had not counted on a woman so desperate she would pay $7 for a ruin. Now that woman was inside and she had children and she was warm and he was not. The ledger was still buried in his saddlebag, the pages intact except for a single corner that had been singed. And Jeb knew that if Emily Cole ever searched the chimney stones, if she ever pried loose the loose brick Becker had shown him in the north flue, she would find something even worse than the truth about the fire. She would find proof that the ledger Jeb held was not the original. There was a duplicate, bound in oilcloth, hidden inside the thermal core itself. Becker had kept 2 copies of everything, and Jeb had never found the other one. 3 nights before the great storm, Emily Cole sat beside the hearth and opened a seam in the stonework that had been bothering her for a week. The chimney had a strange hollow echo when she tapped a certain spot 2 feet above the floor, a dull thud instead of a solid ring. She had thought it was a crack, but as the firelight flickered, she saw a thin line of soot outlining a single cut brick. She worked a knife blade into the gap and pried. The brick came loose with a soft scrape, and behind it was a cavity the size of a small book. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a thin sheaf of papers covered in tight German script. Emily could not read German, but she recognized numbers, dates, and the name Corey, repeated several times alongside sums of money. One line read, J. Corey, $47 stolen. Another page was a crude map of the homestead, showing the double chimney, the forge base, and a dotted line leading to the words Offenhers, furnace heart with measurements. Emily did not understand the writing, but she understood that the man who had visited her claiming to be a trapper had told her his name was not Corey. He had said his name was Stillwater. A lie. She slid the papers back into the cavity and replaced the brick, then sat thinking for a long time while the wind moaned outside. She did not tell Jacob. She did not speak the fear aloud, but she began moving the heavy timber across the door every night now, and she started keeping the poker in the bed beside her. The storm that would later be called the Great Bitterroot Freeze did not arrive with a roar. It arrived with a whisper so subtle that even the oldest settlers in the valley failed to recognize it. On the morning of November 28th, the sky turned an unnatural shade of pale green, and the wind died so completely that a man could hear his own heartbeat at 20 paces. The temperature had already been sitting near zero for days, but over the next 6 hours it plunged to 40 degrees below, then 45, then 50. Chickens froze mid-stride in their coops. A horse left outside at a homestead near the river was found the next morning standing upright, frozen solid. The cold was not just dangerous, it was structural. It shrank iron, split pine logs, and turned leather brittle as glass. Inside the Becker chimney, the thermal core glowed faintly through a crack in the inner flue that Emily had discovered while feeding the fire. She had started burning heavier chunks of oak that she had salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding, and the chimney responded. The heat did not simply fill the room. It seemed to sink into the floor stones, into the patched walls, into the very bones of the children. Jacob stopped wearing his coat indoors. Ruth's fever broke that first night of the deep freeze, and she woke hungry, her cheeks flushed pink with health rather than sickness. Emily fed them both and stared into the flames, wondering how long it could last. The woodpile was shrinking faster now, because she was burning hotter to offset the outside cold. She had perhaps 10 days of fuel remaining if the temperature did not rise. Jeb Corey had no wood at all. His stump shelter had caved under the weight of the first dusting of snow, and he had abandoned it. He was moving now by pure instinct, crawling through the drifts toward the homestead that he could see as a faint glow against the dark, the double chimney smoke rising in a straight column through the frozen air. He could feel the heat calling him. The blackened tips of his fingers had begun to split, and the pain had disappeared entirely, replaced by a terrifying emptiness. He knew what that meant. The tissue was dead. When he reached the edge of the clearing, Jeb crouched behind a snow-bent pine and watched the cabin. The door was barred from inside. He could hear the heavy timber clunk into place when Emily threw it. The chimney stood like a fortress tower, its stones glowing faintly at the seams where the heat had melted the snow away. He could feel the warmth radiating outward even at 40 feet. She was in there. The children were in there, and he was out here. He could try to break down the door, but he was weak and she was armed. He could wait for her to leave, but she would never go out in this storm. He could try to climb onto the tinder-dry remnants of the roof, but the frost would kill him before he got a foothold. There was only one way into that heat. He would have to ask. But Jeb Corey could not simply knock on the door and hope. He needed leverage. He needed her to open the door and let him stay. He needed a story. And so, standing in the killing cold with his dead fingers curled into frozen claws, Jeb began to spin a lie that might just be awful enough to work. He would tell her he was a survivor of a wagon party that had broken through the river ice, that his wife was inside, that he needed shelter until the storm passed. He would weep. He would beg. She was a mother. She would not turn away a weeping man. And once inside, when the children were asleep, he would take the chimney for himself. The plan was desperate and thin, but Jeb Corey was out of time. He stumbled forward out of the tree line, made his voice as broken as he could, and knocked on the door of the house he had burned down. Emily Cole did not answer immediately. She stood on the other side with the poker in her hand and her children behind her, and listened to the wind and the knocking and the voice calling for help in a name she had never heard before. She knew the voice. It was the trapper, the liar, the man from the ledger. Now the Bitterroot sky was starting to unload the heaviest snow in living memory, and the temperature was still dropping. The chimney was the only source of heat for 6 miles. Emily Cole had a choice to make: open the door and risk everything, or leave a man to freeze on her doorstep while her children listened to him cry. The door did not open. Jeb Corey pounded again, and this time the force of his blows sent a crack splitting through the frozen wood of the upper panel. His voice was hoarse, each word shredding through a throat already half closed from the cold. He called out the name of a wife who did not exist, described a wagon accident on the river that had never happened, and wept real tears that froze to his cheeks before they could fall. The performance was almost perfect, but Emily had already heard his true name in the pages of a dead man's book. She pulled Jacob close and pressed her mouth to his ear. "Take Ruth behind the chimney. Do not come out. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." The boy's eyes were wide and wet, but he had spent enough nights hungry to understand that sometimes survival meant silence. He gathered his sister in his small arms and vanished into the shadows behind the hearth. Emily turned back toward the door. The poker was cold iron in her grip. She had no weapon training, no size advantage, no husband to stand in the gap. What she had was a chimney that she now understood better than the man who had helped build it. She had read the papers hidden in the brick cavity again and again over the past 3 days, piecing together meaning from numbers and diagrams, even where the German words refused to yield. The split-spiral flue was not just a heating system. It was a trap, a design flaw never corrected that old man Becker had sketched with a single note in the margin. Gasrückfluss nicht schließen, backdraft, do not seal. If someone blocked the north flue while the fire was hot, the smoke and gas would reverse into the room. If someone blocked both flues simultaneously, the pressure would build until the thermal core cracked. If someone built the fire too high and sealed the chimney cap, the entire thing would exhale flame like a dragon's mouth. Becker had known this. He had lived with the danger for 30 years by simply never overloading the forge and always leaving the damper open a crack. Jeb Corey had never learned that final lesson because Becker had not trusted him enough to teach it. Emily moved toward the door, unbarred the heavy timber, and stepped back. "Come in slowly," she said, letting her voice carry the tremor of a frightened woman. "I have children. Please, no sudden movements." The lie tasted like copper in her mouth, but it was the only weapon she had. The door swung inward, and Jeb Corey stumbled across the threshold like a man escaping a flood. He was barely recognizable. His face had collapsed into hollows and sharp edges, his beard was a mat of ice, and his right hand hung from the wrist like a dead bird. The blackened fingertips had split open, exposing flesh beneath that had already turned to leather. He smelled of rot and wood smoke and old guilt. He saw the fire first, his eyes fixed on the glowing hearth with an intensity that Emily recognized immediately. It was not gratitude, it was hunger. The hunger of a man who had been cold for so long that warmth had become the only god he believed in. He shuffled toward the chimney without asking permission, without looking at the children he had claimed to be searching for, without even removing his frozen coat. He knelt before the flames and held out his dying hands, and for a long moment he simply breathed. Then he turned and saw Emily's face in the firelight, not the frightened widow he expected. A woman standing with her back straight and an iron poker held not in fear but in readiness. He knew instantly that his story had failed. His eyes flicked toward the shadows behind the chimney where the children were hidden, then back to the poker, then to the loose brick in the north flue that he had not thought about in 3 years but now recognized as the hiding place he had always suspected Becker of using. The brick was slightly out of alignment. She had found it. "You know who I am," Jeb said. It was not a question. "I know you stole from the cavalry. I know you burned this house to hide the theft. I know your name is Corey, not Stillwater. And I know that the man who built this chimney died because you lit a fire in his hay loft and let the roof fall on him." She spoke the words without shouting, each one laid down like a stone. The wind outside screamed through a lull, and for a heartbeat the cabin was so silent that the crackle of the fire sounded like breaking bones. Jeb did not deny it. He had spent 3 years denying it, first to the marshal who had accepted the story of an accident, then to himself in the long nights alone in the high country. But the cold had burned something out of him. What remained was too tired to lie. "I only wanted the book," he said, his voice crumbling at the edges. He ran into the flames. I tried to pull him out. The beam came down on his back and he was gone before I could lift it. I tried. He looked at his ruined hand. "Now the frost is going to finish what the fire started. I am dying, Mrs. Cole. I have been dying for 3 days and I am so cold that I cannot remember what warm feels like. I only wanted to be warm one more time before the end." Emily did not lower the poker. "You will not touch my children." "I have no interest in your children," Jeb said, and there was a flash of something almost honest in his hollow eyes. "I only wanted the chimney." He laughed then, a broken sound like a cough trying to be a chuckle. "Funny thing, I helped build this chimney 40 years ago, carried the clay up from the river, mixed the limestone into the mortar. Becker said it would outlast us both. I guess he was right." The wind slammed into the cabin with a force that shook the patched walls and sent a puff of ash swirling out of the hearth. The temperature had fallen another 10 degrees in the past hour, and the storm was only now reaching its full fury. Entire sections of the Bitterroot Valley were vanishing beneath drifts that would not melt until spring. Livestock that had survived the first 3 nights were beginning to suffocate in their barns as snow sealed every crack and seam. The storm was no longer a weather event. It was a geological process, reshaping the landscape one frozen minute at a time. Inside the cabin, the chimney continued its quiet work. The thermal core had absorbed so much energy over the past weeks that the stones themselves acted as a secondary fuel source. Even if the fire burned to ash, the rock would radiate for hours. Emily had timed it once. 4 hours and 12 minutes between the last ember and the first chill. In a world where temperature was death, that margin was the difference between a mother who woke to feed her children and a mother who never woke at all. Jeb's breathing was becoming shallow. The warmth from the hearth was pulling the last moisture from his body, and the frostbite that had been spreading inward was now meeting the sudden dilation of blood vessels as his skin warmed. The combination was catastrophic. His fingers began to bleed dark sluggish drops that stained the hearthstones. He stared at his hand as if it belonged to someone else, then looked up at Emily with an expression that was neither fear nor regret. It was confusion. The confusion of a man who had planned to kill for a chimney and was now too broken to lift a knife. "I could have waited until you slept," he said quietly. "I could have broken the door, I could have done what I came here to do." He swallowed hard. "But I knocked, I don't know why I knocked." Emily watched him for a long moment, the poker still steady in her grip. "Because you were a smith once," she said, "and smiths knock before entering a forge. Becker taught you that." Jeb closed his eyes. Somewhere in the hollow of his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 years began to crack. Not thaw, just crack. He sank back against the wall beneath the north flue, and his weight pressed against the loose brick that Emily had already removed and replaced. The brick shifted with a soft scrape that neither of them could hear over the wind. The backdraft began slowly. The north flue had been designed to draw air from the room and feed it into the central column, balancing the flow between the two chimneys. But the loose brick had left a gap, and Jeb's weight had pushed it further inward. Now the flue was partially obstructed, and the hot gases rising from the fire found resistance where they expected an open channel. They hesitated. They pooled. They began to curl backward into the room in invisible threads. Jacob smelled it first. The boy had been crouched behind the chimney with his sister wrapped in his arms, and his nose was closer to the floor where the gas began to settle. He coughed once, a small dry cough, and Ruth stirred in her sleep. The sound reached Emily like a needle sliding under her skin. She turned and saw the faint haze beginning to drift out from the seam between the chimney stones, and in that instant she understood exactly what was happening. The loose brick, the blocked flue, the diagram in the ledger, Gasrukfluss. She moved without thinking. She crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed the loose brick with both hands, and pried it free. The gap opened, and the trapped gases found their release. A plume of smoke and heat shot upward through the flue with a roar that rattled the stone. The chimney had cleared itself, but the brick that she had pulled free was not just a piece of stone. Behind it, wedged into a smaller secondary cavity that Jeb had never known existed, was another bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Emily unwrapped it while Jeb watched, too exhausted to move. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in English this time, in a shaky hand that must have been Becker's final attempt to be understood. It read, "The furnace heart is layered with iron plates from the war. They will hold heat through the coldest night. If you are reading this, the chimney has chosen you. Trust the second flue. It will never fail if you keep the fire low and steady. And if the man who burned this house ever returns, do not be afraid. The forge has already judged him." Jeb Corey read the words upside down from where he sat against the wall. When he finished, he did not speak for a long time. Then he made a sound that might have been a laugh if there had been any breath behind it. "He knew," Jeb whispered. "All those years he knew I would come back. He built a judgment into the stones." The storm howled around the cabin for 2 more days, and when it finally broke, the Bitterroot Valley was a white desert. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The drifts had climbed 18 feet in some places, burying barns up to their roof lines and turning wagon trails into memory. Of the 12 homesteads in the valley, 6 were completely cut off. 3 lost livestock. 1 lost a man who had tried to reach his woodpile and had been found 10 feet from his door. The settlement called it the Winter of the White Death, and every family that survived it had a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. Emily Cole's story was different. When the thaw finally came in late March and a search party from Fort Missoula made its way up the frozen valley, they expected to find the Becker claim empty. A widow and 2 children in a burned-out shack with no man to cut wood and no money to buy supplies. The math of the frontier said they should have been dead by December. Instead, the soldiers found smoke rising from the double chimney, a neat path shoveled through the snow, and a 6-year-old boy dragging a sled loaded with firewood while a toddler laughed from the porch. The cabin was still patched together with scavenged boards and canvas, but it was warm. The stones of the hearth were warm. The floor was warm. The woman who opened the door was lean and tired, but her eyes were clear and her voice was steady. She offered the soldiers hot coffee and did not apologize for the condition of the house. She was not a widow living in a ruin. She was the owner of a $7 homestead that had outlasted the worst winter in recorded history. The soldiers did not ask about the body they found in the linta behind the cabin, wrapped in a canvas sheet and frozen solid. Jeb Corey had lasted 3 days inside the chimney's warmth before the blood poisoning from his frostbite had finally stopped his heart. He had died in the linta because Emily had refused to let him stay in the main room after the second day, when his confession had grown too loud and too detailed, and Jacob had begun to understand what the man was saying about the fire and the old German and the stolen money. She had given Jeb blankets and a place near the outer chimney wall, where the stones radiated enough heat to keep a man alive if he was strong enough to fight. He had not been strong enough, but Emily had not killed him. The chimney had simply failed to save him, and on the frontier, those were 2 different things. Before the soldiers left, Emily gave them the oilcloth packet with Becker's final letter and the duplicate ledger pages that proved Jeb Corey's theft. She told them the whole story, from the $7 to the loose brick to the backdraft that could have killed them all if she had not understood the chimney's secret. The lieutenant in charge wrote everything down in a field notebook, his ink freezing between words, and promised to file the report at the fort. The report made its way east over the following months, through military channels and eventually into the hands of a newspaper editor in Chicago who was looking for stories of frontier survival to fill his winter editions. By the following autumn, the story of Emily Cole and the $7 homestead had been printed in newspapers as far away as New York and San Francisco. The headline in the Chicago Tribune read, "Widow buys burned shack for $7, survives White Death through German Smith's secret chimney." The article included a drawing of the double chimney, a diagram of the split spiral flue, and a brief mention of the iron plates that Becker had salvaged from the war. Engineers wrote letters debating the physics of the thermal core. Architects in Boston and Philadelphia began experimenting with forge-based heating systems in new construction. A professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology published a paper titled "On the Retention and Release of Thermal Energy in Stone Masses," citing the Becker chimney as a case study. Emily Cole received none of the credit and all of the benefit. The notoriety of the story reached William Cole, her brother-in-law, who had been sitting on the stolen farm for over a year and had told everyone in the settlement that Emily was dead or disgraced. The newspaper article made that lie impossible to maintain. Within a month, a lawyer from Missoula appeared at the Becker claim with a letter from the county recorder, stating that the original deed to the Cole farm had never been properly transferred, and that Emily, as Thomas Cole's lawful widow, was entitled to reclaim it. William fought the ruling for 6 months and lost, as men who build their power on lies often do when the truth finally catches up to them. Emily sold the coal farm the following spring for a sum that would have made Thomas proud. She kept the Becker claim. She had not fallen in love with the burned-out shack or the patched walls or the canvas roof that still leaked in heavy rain, but she had fallen in love with the chimney. She had fallen in love with the way the stones held warmth long after the fire died, the way the twin flues hummed in perfect balance when the wind came from the north, the way the hearthstone beneath her feet felt like solid ground in a world that had tried to swallow her whole. Over the following decades, the Becker chimney became a local landmark. Travelers passing through the Bitterroot Valley would detour miles off the main trail just to see it. They would stand in the room where Emily Cole had spent that winter, lay their hands on the warm stones, and ask the same question. How had a furnace built before the war saved a family through the coldest winter on record? The answer was always the same. It was not the design alone, though the design was clever. It was not the iron plates, though the iron plates held heat longer than any ordinary stone. It was the fact that Emily Cole had trusted the chimney before she understood it, fed it wood when she barely had enough for herself, and protected its secret from the man who would have destroyed it. Jacob grew up to become a surveyor and later an engineer, specializing in the design of thermal heating systems for government buildings in the Northern Territories. He never tired of telling people that he had learned thermodynamics before he knew the word, sitting cross-legged on the hearthstones of the Becker claim, while his mother explained why the chimney pulled one way in the morning and another way at night. Ruth became a teacher and eventually a writer, and in 1902 she published a small memoir titled The Warm Stones, which told the story of that winter from a child's perspective. The book sold modestly and was forgotten within a generation, but a copy of it sat on the mantel of the Becker chimney until the day the homestead finally passed out of family hands. The chimney itself stood for 91 years. It survived fires, earthquakes, and the slow march of modern heating that made forged stone technology obsolete. In 1973, a historic preservation society acquired the property and restored the double chimney to its original condition, removing the patched walls and canvas roof that had long since collapsed and building a small museum around the hearth. Visitors today can still stand in the room where Emily Cole spent that winter. They can see the loose brick beneath the north flue, the cavity where she found the ledger, and the faint scorch mark on the ceiling from the night of the backdraft. And if they visit in winter, when the caretaker lights a small fire to demonstrate the chimney's function, they can feel the warmth that saved a widow and 2 children in the winter of the White Death. But there is one detail that the museum does not mention. One final piece of the story that Ruth Cole only learned decades later, when she was sorting through her mother's papers after Emily's death. Hidden in a tin box beneath the hearthstone, wrapped in the same oilcloth that had protected Becker's ledger, was a single sheet of paper in Emily's handwriting. It was a deed, not to the Cole farm, not to the Becker claim. It was a deed to the chimney itself, written out in careful script and signed by Emily Cole on the morning after the storm broke. It read, "I, Emily Cole, do hereby claim ownership of the furnace heart and all stonework attached in perpetuity for the sum of $7 already paid, witnessed by Jacob Cole, age 7, and Ruth Cole, age 2. Below the signature was a final line, added later in a shakier hand. The chimney saved us. The chimney is ours. No man shall ever take our warmth again." That deed was never filed with any county recorder. It was never legally binding. But Emily Cole kept it beneath the hearthstone for 47 years, and when she died in the winter of 1933 at the age of 81, the stones on which she had built her life were still warm. In the end, the chimney did more than hold heat. It held a memory. Old man Becker, the German smith with the terrible temper, had poured his last years into those stones, layering iron from a war he'd fled and clay from a river he'd loved, knowing the forge would outlast him. He could not have known that his work would save a widow he'd never meet. He could not have known that the very flaw in the flue, the backdraft he'd warned against, would one day expose the man who murdered him. Yet somehow, the chimney held the truth as tightly as it held warmth. Emily Cole lived 47 more winters, and she never left that homestead. The patched walls became solid log. The canvas roof became shingle, but the hearth remained exactly as she found it. She told her grandchildren that the stones had a voice. Not a voice you heard with your ears, but one you felt in your bones when the north wind screamed and the fire burned low and the chimney answered back with a slow, steady heat that said, "You are not alone in this." What do you call that? Some would call it luck. Others would call it engineering, a master smith's design, a thermal battery built before the word existed. But the people who lived through that winter in the Bitterroot Valley, the ones who watched a woman with nothing walk into a burned ruin and walk out in the spring with two healthy children, they called it something else. They called it impossible, and when the impossible happens, it leaves a mark. The Becker chimney still stands today, not as a relic but as a reminder. It reminds us that the things we discard often hold the most power. A $7 shack, a charred foundation, a family told they were worthless. In the hands of someone who refuses to quit, these become fortresses. And sometimes, the very storm that should have killed you becomes the thing that builds your shelter instead. If this story stayed with you, imagine the one still buried beneath the snow of the past. Subscribe to this channel and we will keep digging them up together.